As the Denver Broncos prepare for the 2025 NFL season, we'll highlight three elements of this team that are facing the most pressure going into this season. Here and much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. For all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more, make sure you become an everydayer here, and a special shout out here to everyone out there in Broncos Country. All the everydayers, thanks for making us your first listen, however you choose to do so, whether it be wherever you get your podcast or on YouTube. So subscribe or follow so you never miss out on what's going on. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, where you can check out my written work daily over there, milehighsports.com, for all your Broncos news, content, and coverage as well.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, the site expert at predominantlyorange.com, where you can find my written work as well.
And here's what you're going to get on today's episode of the show. Happy Friday, Broncos Country. We're going to highlight three aspects of this team that are facing the most pressure in 2025. Is Riley Moss under the microscope a little bit more after coming back from an injury last year and struggling? We'll talk about how Riley Moss can change the perception of him this upcoming season. Plus, Sean Payton entering his third year as the head coach of the team, 2 years. He's had his quarterback, but now going into another year with Bo Nix as his guy, what must he provide this year to erase some of the pressure, maybe in optics on him? And then we'll also take a look at some other players going into training camp who will be under pressure, under the microscope a little bit, as contracts are potentially nearing their end for them. So we'll take a look at all that on today's episode of the show. Sayre, let's kick things off here with, obviously, I think when we talk about pressure, I think if you look at any fan commentary, you look at Twitter, you look at even our YouTube comments, I don't understand the massive 360 that this fan base has had towards Riley Moss. I know we talked about it a little bit last week on some of the shows here, but I'd say because of this dynamic that we've seen with the fan base, who for 13 straight weeks were singing Riley's praises. They're saying, wow, Riley and PS2 are the best cornerback duo in the league. They were creating nicknames for the guys. Has a bad game, against Cincinnati Bengals and T. Higgins, and all of a sudden, everyone's like, we're soured on Riley Moss now. I don't understand it, but, because of the fan pressure, how can Riley Moss maybe change the perception of him here in 2025?
Well, Cody, I think as with any player on the roster who's under pressure, I think you come out and you get off to a hot start, right? To the offseason, to training camp, to preseason, but certainly when we get to the regular season, if Riley Moss is out there making plays on the ball, I feel like fans are going to kind of remember pretty quickly what he was doing for the majority of last season. And that's the really tough part about this. And you and I have had multiple discussions on this. We're like Mugatu on Zoolander. We're like, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills over here. We're talking about Riley Moss and why fans are saying maybe he should be benched, or this guy should be playing over him, or he wasn't really that good. And we were just kind of fooled by a couple of games that, and a true, just like, I don't know, lightning in a bottle sort of situation that just went away for the Denver Broncos. Riley Moss wasn't that. He was one of the best players on the defense before he got hurt against the Raiders. So I think to recapture that magic, Cody, all the guy has to do is get off to a hot start. And that's not the only thing. And I don't even think like there's this mandate, Riley Moss has to get off to a hot start, or else clearly he was a bust, or clearly last year was not really an indicator of future success. I don't think that's the case. I think that to ease the, unrest of some of the fan base, maybe that's what he has to do. But I don't know. You tell me, Cody. I think that it's one of the most interesting discussions we're having already here in the offseason.
I feel like there have been a lot of false narratives surrounding the Broncos' plans at the cornerback position and how it pertains to Riley Moss, especially with Denver selecting Jahdae Barron. Look, I still see fans will reply on Twitter. You'll see people post on Twitter that Jahdae Barron was added because, to replace Riley Moss. That's not the case. And people are saying, well, Riley's a slot. Jahdae is going to be on the outside. And I just try to ask myself, where is this coming from? Because being at practice, we're not seeing that. It is Riley on the outside, PS2, and Jahdae's been working in the inside with Jaquan McMillan. We haven't seen a lot of that. When Riley's on the field, he's not playing inside the slot. PS2 is not playing inside the slot. It's Jaquan McMillan or it's Jahdae Barron at that point. So this narrative that, Jahdae's just going to be the outside corner opposite of PS2, that's not the plan. That's not the vision that this Broncos team has. And look, while some of the fan base's perception on Riley Moss has apparently soured, I can tell you with 100% certainty, based on coaches I've talked to, based on a couple of people in the building, and based on what I've seen in practice, the team is not down on Riley Moss, and his teammates aren't down on him in any way, shape, or form. After the Cincinnati Bengals game, I had a chance to talk to him briefly, and I said, hey, keep grinding. How you feeling? He's like, I'm good. He said, hey, like, you're going to have games like this. Like, this is the NFL. You're going to have a bad game. He said, my teammates got my back. That's the only thing that I care about. And I can tell you that Riley is a dog out there. He's going to have a big role here this upcoming season. And I can tell you that his spot at corner is not in danger in any way, shape, or form. And with that, too, I think it also goes to the reality of what happens when you have a guy like Pat Surtain opposite of you, right? The reigning, defending, undisputed NFL Defensive Player of the Year. Naturally, you're going to see more targets if you're the other cornerback. And that's what I asked Sean Payton during one of the offseason OTA practices. I asked him how Riley's been doing, where he's at in the mix. And he says, naturally, when you're playing opposite of Pat, you're going to get targeted a lot more. That was the case. And I think sometimes, Sarah, people will look at, I look at Pro Football Reference, and he gave up this many catches on this many targets, and this was the passer rating allowed. There's a lot of missing context into that, right? Because okay, you could give up a catch even if you're playing 6 yards off the ball, but let's say you're playing zone and your coverage is the deep third responsibility. The quarterback throws a short hitch. You go up there and tackle because you're the nearest defender. That's how Pro Football Reference accounts for targets, catches allowed, yards. They factor all that into it. So it's not necessarily the gospel, but it is a little bit of, something you look at and it's like, oh, well, people are drawing a conclusion. Well, I looked at this and this indicates that Riley's bad. People don't use their eyes anymore. They don't watch Riley play. Like for 13 straight weeks, we saw Riley knocking passes away, covering guys, coming up and tackling, just being a dog, and in the passing game and against the run. And all of a sudden, it's like, yeah, Riley's there. He goes down with the injury. We had people saying the Broncos season is over. Riley Moss got hurt. We don't know how long he's at, but man, the defense is in trouble if he's out. And then all of a sudden, that narrative has changed. Like it's so weird to me, sir. It's the weirdest development, I'd say, of 2024 all the way up until now in 2025.
And that one game against the Bengals skewed not only the fans' perspective, but really skewed his numbers, Cody. I can't remember exactly how many touchdowns Burrow threw in his direction in that game. It was either 2 or 3. 2. So he allowed 4 total touchdowns, according to the aforementioned Pro Football Reference last year. So 4 total touchdowns allowed on the year in 14 games. 2 of them came in one game. So half of his touchdowns allowed came against T. Higgins.
One was against Godwin. Week 3
one was against Godwin, and
Jalen
that one
Coulter
was not. He had tight coverage on a couple of those touchdowns that he allowed as well. So I don't think that there's really any reason to worry. I think that the reason to worry here is that the perception of him has gotten so sour that he might be a couple of rough games at the beginning of the year away from, okay, now everybody's going to be calling for the rookie, just like they call for the backup quarterback when the backup quarterback is struggling. And I think that's unfair to put that on him because he's a young player. We know that development is not always linear, especially when you're dealing with injuries. And I think maybe that's the only knock right now, right? Is that he struggled with injuries in his first season. And then in the second season, you go down with another injury. That's beyond his control, but it can cause frustration. I don't think that's done anything to diminish the way that he played last year, which was pretty darn outstanding. I mean, can he come out there and make more plays on the ball? Absolutely. But when you look at his yards per target last season, Cody, 7.3 yards per target into his coverage. I mean, the guy, he was targeted 103 times. So this is a high volume going in his direction, and he shut things down even when passes were completed in his coverage. So to me, I think that this is a player that the Broncos can build around. He's not somebody that's, I don't think, fighting for his spots. I think this is somebody that you really want to, hey, we're going to put him in the lineup and let him finish out his contract as a starter and see where it goes from there. Hopefully he's more along the lines of a big money deal than he is all right, we got to replace him with Jahdae Barron and these other guys that we got to the draft. I think that's where Riley Moss is right now, is he's more of a cornerstone piece to me than he is a question mark.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And look, you mentioned the 4 touchdowns, the 2 to T. Higgins. The overtime winner, I would say, from T. Higgins was probably, the one where there was probably more separation than anything he gave up. The one he gave up against the Carolina Panthers was a back shoulder throw that was well placed by Bryce Young. One to Chris Godwin, where Riley was in perfect position and Baker Mayfield put it at a spot where it was just perfect for him and the wide receiver, no matter how good the coverage was. And then what was the other one that he had there? I'm trying to remember. I think we were just talking about
one to Higgins.
It was the other one to T, and that's where like T was in like that back end of the end zone where Riley's hand is in the cookie jar there, and T's length was just obviously a difference maker. So I just think that the narrative is a little unfair. And I know certainly people are probably going to disagree, but you know what? That's why we have these discussions. Broncos Country want to hear from you. Do you think that Riley Moss is under a lot of pressure going into 2025? Make sure you let us know here on today's episode of the show. But as Sean Payton gears up for his third season with the Broncos, having his quarterback in place, there are a handful of things that Sean Payton and this Broncos offense must provide here in 2025, and the pressure that comes with that. We'll talk about that here on today's episode of the show.
Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by FanDuel. We are at the epic conclusion of the NBA Finals, Game 7, and you know that there's going to be highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments with everything on the line. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player in this particular game, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel, they're going to make it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big.
Well, which players are showing up in the biggest moments? Tyrese Halliburton, Game 7. The moment doesn't get any bigger than that. And the Indiana Pacers, they are 7.5-point road underdogs in Game 7 against OKC. Can they go and shock the world? We're hoping for that here in the Mile High City. If you're new to FanDuel, it's a perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, you get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Most people didn't expect much from the Denver Broncos in 2024, but in 2025, which is year 3 of the Sean Payton era now, the pressure is on. What do we have to see in year 3 of Sean Payton's tenure as the Denver Broncos head coach? We're going to talk about that coming up on today's episode. Locked On Broncos, mile high salute to every single one of you out there that makes us your first listen of the day every single day. Cody, really excited for year 3 of Sean Payton in Denver. I think you and I were both excited for year 1. It's such a stark contrast from the way the Broncos had operated in any previous year post Gary Kubiak. This team has operated at I would say the best way that I can put it just feels like more of a professional football team. You don't feel
adult
like
in the room
out there. Yeah, exactly. You feel like you have an adult in the room, and Sean Payton has completely changed the culture of this team back to what it was, which is that the expectation now, which was most of my upbringing, Cody, and I'm sure yours as well, that the Broncos would be good, that the Broncos would be playoff contenders, that the Broncos would be at the top of the AFC West or competing for the top of the AFC West. What do you think is the number one non-negotiable for Sean Payton now that he's in year 3 as head coach of this team?
Well, I think so much of it because Sean is in control of the offense. He's the play caller there. I think there's so much of the dynamic that Sean has with this offense that is going to be under the microscope a little bit more, right? I think first year you look at it, trying to figure out if that marriage with Russell Wilson was going to work out. Could Sean, because one of the bigger things that Sean came into that marriage and that relationship with was saying, hey, like we need to be able to win within the pocket a lot more versus Russ's game, which escape pressure, schoolyard, backyard football, try to make plays happen downfield by extending plays. While that works sometimes, like Sean acknowledged, like you can't do that. That can't be your identity to try to win games in the NFL. It's different. You have to be able to win from within the pocket. And so you go out and you get a quarterback like Bo Nix, who is very good in the pocket and can make those plays, but that's not part of his game. Like being hard to sack, like that was a thing. Like Russell Wilson took so many sacks where Bo Nix didn't. Like Bo knew when to get rid of the ball, and Bo knew how to get out of those situations where I'm not going to dance and wait. I'm going to try to get as north-south as I can here. For Sean, I think for him as the play caller, Sayre, you want to see more balance on the offensive side of the ball, right? We saw the Broncos at times get a little too pass happy last year. And granted, that could have been a byproduct of Sean not trusting the run game. But if the run game can get going and you have this balance, not only does that take pressure off of Sean as the play caller, it takes pressure off of Bo Nix as the quarterback. And now that offensive unit might be able to put up even better numbers and be more consistent, have something that's a little bit more sustainable going forward. To me, that's one of the more important elements here for Sean Payton going into his third year is balance offensively. That's one of those pressure points.
I think so too. I think that's going to be really. It's the picture of when he was holding the card, the play sheet card at the. I can't remember what game it was that basically
Chargers.
said, the Chargers game, where it was basically, for lack of any, we got to keep it family friendly here, but it basically said run the ball on the back, right? And so I think that's the thing is like we got away from any sort of balance for I don't know what reasons. You and I would talk on post games like, why did they stop handing the ball to Estime when he was hot? Why did they stop going to this when it was working? And so that frustration there, it almost felt like at times like Sean was feeding that narrative. And I know this isn't the case. I'm just saying it felt like it at times that he was trying to like propel Bo Nix to a better season as a rookie, statistically speaking, to kind of prove people wrong. And I don't know. I'm not saying that that's what he was doing. I'm saying that's kind of what it felt like at times. It's like you need to run the ball here. Why is Bo throwing? That's my personal frustration with that aside. But I think another thing that Sean Payton has to do in year 3, Cody, we have to see better results in 1-score games, right? When the Broncos have gotten into 1-score games, they have struggled. At least last year they did. I know that they had that nice little run in the 2023 season where they were kind of lucky in tight games. They were coming through in clutch situations. This past season, however, 1-6 in 1-score games. And everybody's like, well, that's because they couldn't beat good teams. I think that that's not the case. The Broncos, they definitely should have beat the Chargers. They definitely should have beat Kansas City, both of those games on the road. And those 1-score games came down to ultimately what? They came down to small little breakdowns here and there throughout the game, or just slightly missed opportunities here and there. So 1-6 in 1-score games, that's got to change. You got to stay where you're at in terms of beating bad teams, but you also have to elevate your game against the better teams. And in those tight games, you have to find ways to finish.
Well, and I'm looking at it as well. Like obviously the Broncos finishing 10-7 last year, like you factor in those 1-score games and you look at like, 10-7 and you were 1-6 in those types of games. We are talking about an entirely different perception on this Broncos team, right? And I think to kind of play into that, another aspect here for Sean Payton is you look at their record on the road. That's got to be an area they improved. They were 4-5 on the road. They were 6-2 at home last year. They took care of business. But I think division play is going to be more important. Denver went 3-3 last year, right? They had 2 wins against the Raiders. They had 1 win against Kansas City. They lost a game against KC, and they were swept by the Chargers. Division play has to be a little bit more of an emphasis, where I think, Sayre, you have to win at least one matchup against every single team in your division, in my opinion. And granted, you want to sweep every team in your division. You want the Broncos 2025 to sweep the Raiders again. You want to find a way to at least split with the Chargers or sweep them. And you got to find a way to obviously split with Kansas City. A sweep will be hard here, but Denver was very close to doing just that if it wasn't for a blocked field goal. So that has to be an area of emphasis here. But I think more importantly, conference record is key. Taking care of conference games to where you're not worried at the end of the season. If you're in that playoff picture and it's like you control your destiny, take care of business. Denver, look, they got 4 wins last year against the NFC South. That helped them. Take care of business against your AFC conference opponents, because that's really what matters. That's what punches your ticket into the dance to get admission to it. And then if you want to be crowned, homecoming king or whatever it may be, well, you need to make sure that you take care of business there in order to be able to do just that. I think those are going to be very big here for Sean Payton, and all of that ties into it, Sayre. The play calling balance, the taking care of business on the 1-score games. But I will say, like, Sean is a stickler on those little details, like everything you talk about in game management, which was why I think that free kick against the Chargers was a little frustrating, because Sean is very much of a situational. We walk through this every, training camp practice, every practice or walk through during the week. We go through every scenario. So maybe it's just about how do you get these guys to lock in on those a little better? I don't know. I mean, I think Sean's coaching about those little details have made a big difference in the turnaround from what we saw in 2023, which is why Denver was back in the conversation. But at some points, some of those lapses of judgment definitely hurt them last season.
And I think that's where Darren Rizzi, he can be a secret weapon for this team in a little bit, right? Or in a little bit of a way, right? Because he was the interim head coach of the New Orleans Saints. He's kind of always been known for his ability to game manage and find those little, because Darren Rizzi is one of the biggest reasons why the NFL is changing the kickoff rules, right? Because he's got all these innovative ideas of how to make the game more entertaining in the special teams area. And so he's one of those types of people that you have on your staff. You got to listen to those types of guys throughout the course of the game, because he's going to be able to give you that set of eyes that you may not be. Even somebody as experienced as Sean Payton needs people like that to help him out in those sorts of situations. So I think that'll be big. And then I agree with you, Cody. I think that it's not that the Broncos haven't stepped up in big situations or against good teams. It's the fact that they've kind of found ways to get in their own way against those good teams, right? You know, you could point back to those Chiefs and Chargers games last year as big reasons why they, or how they got in their own way. And then you could look at the other one score games that they ended up losing that were just so frustrating, like getting 3 or 4 chances late against the Cincinnati Bengals, and you totally drop the ball in those situations. I think that's another example right there. That's just so frustrating that you had these chances to do something special in a big opportunity in a big game against a good team, and you got in your own way some way or the other. So that's another thing, is that, okay, those things can't keep on happening. Why does all the good stuff happen to Kansas City? They seem to have all the luck. You got to get, fortune favoring you in some sort of way. You've got to get the good luck on your side and the ball bouncing your way somehow.
Well, that's why we talk about it. Pressure, it either creates diamonds or it bursts pipes. And our conversation on pressure, pushing down on me, continues here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. We're going to talk about one coach on the staff that has a lot of pressure facing him this upcoming season. You get all that much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Under pressure. Dun, 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 dun. All right, we're talking about coaches here. As we close out today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, we appreciate you, Broncos Country, as always here. But, we've highlighted Riley Moss, the pressure facing him, Sean Payton. But let's get into some of the subcategories here, because I think that there's an assistant coach that maybe has a little bit of pressure on him to perform or to have his unit perform this upcoming season. And on top of that, maybe a couple of young players as well. Sayre, let's kick things off. I think we look at this coaching staff. Sean Payton is, as he said, he's slow to hire, quick to fire type situation here. And obviously we saw him make some changes after lackluster production at several positions on the coaching staff. One firing had to do with an off the field legal issue. One of them was a production based one, and that was obviously Greg Minuski, the inside linebacker coach. I feel like we look at the running back position right now. I feel like Lou Ayeni might have some pressure on him this upcoming season, because he was brought in, highly touted, highly regarded. Sean Payton even acknowledged that, the reviews about him and the hiring process were big. But we have yet to see production from that room be a strength of this team. And part of me is feeling like this is it. Like, this is a big season here for that running back position to take the next step. Could RJ Harvey, J.K. Dobbins alleviate that pressure for Lou Ayeni? Certainly that's the hope. But I would say if we're looking at a coaching member on the staff, Lou Ayeni definitely probably has some pressure, at least from an optics standpoint.
And Sean Payton kind of put it out there, didn't he? By saying that last year, I felt like there was a lot of meat left on the bone when it came to the running game. And so if I'm Lou Ayeni, I'm saying that's a direct reflection on me and my guys, and I've got to get them right. I've got to make sure that we're not wasting what many people believe to be these days, Cody, potentially the number one offensive line in the NFL. And when the Broncos are throwing the ball as well as they were last year, because they did throw the ball pretty darn well, you have to kind of be self-reflective and say, all right, how are every single week we're seemingly not doing our part to help out in the offensive? We're not getting enough yards on first down. We're putting the team in too many 2nd and 8 situations, or we're getting behind the sticks. It's 2nd and 11 because our backs are getting blown up in the backfield, or they're taking, trying to take the ball to the outside and they're not trusting their blocks, or whatever it may be. So I think this is a huge year for him and that position group in particular, where now you've got somebody like J.K. Dobbins who's proven, and you brought in R.J. Harvey that your general manager, George Payton, said may have the best vision of any back in this draft, which we know was absolutely loaded at running back. So if that's the case, you've got to get your guys ready to go, and that has to be one of the most improved units on the entire roster in 2025.
And obviously with a coach, as good of a coach as Ayeni is and how many people praise him, you are right. Like that production is a reflection on you as a coach. And even if you're coaching up the right points and your guys aren't executing, that can cost you your job in the NFL. We've seen it happen all the time, whether it be on the Broncos over the last handful of years, or when you talk about position coaches or even talk about historically in the NFL, you see guys released because that room doesn't produce. And so I think that's definitely something for us to monitor here going forward. Maybe even as well, like we talk about pressure, there's always this inherent pressure if you are a player whose contract is expiring. There are a handful of players there this year that are after 2025. They are set to be free agents here. I feel like there are a handful of players here on the Broncos that are certainly going to be a little bit under pressure when free agency hits here this upcoming season.
Yeah, obviously Zach Allen, Nick Bonito, the guys that we've been talking about all offseason. Cortland Sutton is another one. The big name players that they are deserving of new contracts. John Franklin Myers, and then you go to the underrated guys like Jaquan McMillan. He's played well enough to get another contract somewhere in the NFL. So, and will it be in Denver? I don't know if that's going to be the case. But this Broncos team is facing a very similar situation that they were last year at this time, Cody, to where you're kind of still trying to figure out which ones of these guys are going to be our foundation pieces, because you're building that foundation now and you're taking advantage of that rookie window that you have with Bo Nix, which is going to last the next handful of years. If all goes well and Bo signs a big time extension down the line, that's not necessarily going to show up on your salary cap until way down the line, right? We know that teams can structure these deals to get low cap hits in the first couple of years. So the Broncos don't have to worry about that right now. What they've got to figure out is which ones of these guys are going to be part of our Super Bowl window that we believe we're going to be in for the next handful of years, the next 3 to 5 years. That's where you have to make those sorts of decisions. And I think that those guys, all of them, especially the ones that maybe you're kind of on the fence about, like a lot of fans on the fence about Nick Bonito getting a new deal, Cody, a lot of fans on the fence about whether or not you can keep both Zach Allen and John Franklin Myers. Going to be fascinating to see when the Broncos finally decide to start pulling the trigger on some of these contracts, which players they believe are part of that window.
Yeah, and look, there are 19 set to be unrestricted free agents. And I feel like when we look at the list of guys here, there certainly could be a reality here where some of these guys don't make it to the 53-man roster this year, and then obviously dwindles the list down a little bit. But I would also say that in this situation, and for the guys that you're talking about, the Alex Singletons, maybe the JFMs, the Nick Bonitos, the Zach Allens, I think there's also pressure on the organization to identify which players are absolutely imperative to your operation, and can you financially do it, right? Like, I do know the Broncos, they value Nick Bonito. I think that's going to take time to be able to framework a deal that is going to make sense, because the market is always changing. And how is Nick going to argue against like the Max Crosbys, the Myles Garretts, when, this is a guy who's getting pick sixes or fumble recoveries for touchdowns and still getting double-digit sacks? That's where it gets a little tricky with his Zach Allen, high pressure player, guy who's contributing to the success of the rest of the defense in a massive way. He's making Pat Surtain's job easier. So when you look at the inherent value, cornerstone pieces, there's as much pressure, I feel like, on the organization to get those guys locked in, including Cortland Sutton, as there is on those players to go out there and perform at a high level and maintain that, and to be able to set that up for them. That is where I think that this is going to be an interesting offseason as well, because as the time that we're sitting down doing the show, no extension yet. Jahdae Barron certainly hasn't signed his rookie deal just yet. RJ Harvey, they haven't found a way to do that. So you can't extend those guys until you get your rookies taken care of. I mean, hypothetically, you could in a sense, but you want to be able to have the bigger picture, at stake. You got J.K. Dobbins who signed his deal. So how does Denver get these guys locked in is a big question that I have. And I don't know how it's all going to play out, Sayre. Is there anybody else, in your opinion, that you feel like could be facing a little bit of pressure this season?
I think young players who are sort of in make or break situations in terms of, I think about specifically Drew Sanders and Troy Franklin. Cody, I think that with Drew, his situation is such that if he doesn't step up as a starting caliber guy this year, you almost figure the Broncos are going to find a way to bring somebody in who's just going to be slotted in as a start, just like Dre Greenlaw is slotted in as a starter, and there's no question about that. They'll bring in somebody else next year that will take over that other spot if Drew doesn't seize the opportunity that he has this year, where things feel a bit more open, even with Alex Singleton coming back from the injury. And then with Troy Franklin, it's another one of those situations where you've got so many other young guys at that position. Can you step up and carve out that role for yourself before either somebody else takes your job or the Broncos go out and say, all right, it didn't work out. We gave it 2 years. We've got to find somebody else to come in and take that role. So I think those guys are in crucial situations to where it could be a make or break year for those players in particular to seize big time roles on this team.
Well, Broncos Country, we want to hear your thoughts here as we conclude today's episode of the show. Which players, coaches do you feel like are facing pressure here heading into the 2025 NFL season? We appreciate all your perspectives here as well, and we always appreciate you for tuning in, locking in here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Special shout out to all the everydayers, first listeners out there. Thank you so much. Here's what you can expect on Monday's episode of the show. As Sayre and I, we're going to sit down. We're going to talk about Bo Nix and Sean Payton and their pairing and what that means for the offensive identity for this Broncos team into year 2 with those guys and that marriage between them and how it's going to impact the Broncos. We'll dive deep into all that and much more on the next episode, Locked On Broncos.